Hi there. Yesterday we talked about Julius Caesar and his early life. Today we're going to look at Julius Caesar at war. Julius Caesar was a lot like Alexander the Great in that his troops really loved him and were willing to do whatever Caesar asked. And so that's something we want to remember when we look at the things that Caesar's troops do for him that they might not have done for another general. Now, Julius Caesar convinces his troops to go against Roman law and enter Rome by crossing a really small and unimportant river called the Rubicon. Now, if we look at this map here, we see the Rubicon up in the northern portion of Rome. Now, the Rubicon itself isn't an important river because of trade or because of travel or because of protection. This is an important river because there's a law around it. And so the law tells us that no armies are allowed within Rome itself. And the border is this river Rubicon. So you can't march your army and be interested in fighting in Rome itself. Crossing the river Rubicon would mean you're doing an act of aggression against Rome. And so that's what makes this important. And if we think about what we learned yesterday, the Senate was not happy with Julius Caesar. And they weren't happy with Julius Caesar because Julius Caesar didn't listen to them when he was in Gaul. He stayed too long. He broke some laws. And so the Senate called him back. But Caesar was afraid that if he came back, he would have to face some repercussions for the things he did in Gaul that upset the Senate. By marching his troops into Rome, he was doing a couple things. First, he was essentially starting a civil war. Second, he was telling the Senate that he was not going to listen to their requests and that he felt he was above these laws. And so Caesar convinced his troops to break the law. And remember that in Rome, the Republic was everything. And so this is a big deal. As they crossed this river, Julius Caesar made a really famous quote, and that is, "The die is cast." And this is something that people will even say today. So die refers to dice. So it's the plural form of the word dice. And Julius Caesar is saying, well, essentially, I rolled the dice. There's no going back. We've crossed this river, and now we're at war. So Caesar's going to fight basically a civil war, and his main enemy in this war is leading the Republic's army, and that's Pompey. And if we remember Pompey, he's one of the triumvirate that Caesar ruled with in his time as consul of Rome. Now, Caesar's army is a very well-trained army. And Caesar and Pompey fight all over. In fact, their most important battle is the Battle of Pharsalus, and that is going to take place in Greece. And at the Battle of Pharsalus, Pompey is defeated, and Caesar takes control of Rome. After this, Pompey, who remember is the leader who the people loved, runs away and goes to Egypt. Now, Caesar doesn't let Pompey just get away to Egypt. Instead, he chases Pompey to Egypt. But when he gets to Egypt, he is presented with a gift by the pharaoh, who's a young boy named Ptolemy. That probably sounds familiar to you because remember, Alexander the Great's general Ptolemy was given Egypt after his death. And so this pharaoh Ptolemy is a descendant of Alexander the Great's general. So the pharaoh Ptolemy is a younger ruler, and when Pompey makes his way to Egypt, Ptolemy has his head cut off. He does that because he believes that Caesar is going to be really happy that Ptolemy supported him in this way. But instead, Caesar is incensed. He's angry. He can't believe a former consul of Rome would be treated in this way. And so Ptolemy winds up being found dead. His body is found floating in a river, and Ptolemy is replaced. Caesar chooses his replacement, and Ptolemy's replacement is his sister Cleopatra, who will be the new pharaoh of Rome installed by Caesar. Now, Crassus, if you remember, is that third leader in the first triumvirate. He is killed in battle, and Caesar, therefore, is the last man standing, and he becomes the leader of Rome. Another outcome of this, we can think of the Senate as a rival of Caesar's because the Senate is the one who wanted to charge him with war crimes. And so Caesar also does some things to the Senate. One of the things he does to the Senate is he increases the Senate to 900. It used to be 300, but now he makes the Senate bigger. This would seem like something he wouldn't want to do, but Caesar also cleverly takes away the power of the Senate. And this is going to make the Senate angry. We also need to think about, where do you think that power went? Well, that power went to Caesar. Caesar ultimately is asked to become king, and he refuses. He says he does not want to be king. Instead, he is going to become a dictator. Dictator for life is the role that he takes. And if you want to become a dictator, here are the steps you should take. The first, you want to get control of an army. Well, we know that Caesar did that. You need to spend 10 years fighting the Gauls and then conquering the Gauls. You're going to march your army toward Rome, cross the Rubicon, and defeat your allies. After all of this, you will be named dictator for life. And now we have Julius Caesar being essentially in sole control of Rome. And Rome has a big triumph for Caesar. And we see in this video, and I mentioned this yesterday, that a triumph is essentially a very, very big party. And this Roman citizens come out and they cheer and they yell and celebrate Caesar. And here is an image of Caesar's triumph. Oops. And we see Caesar being led in. And all of this imagery with the red face and the crown held above his head is to show that Caesar is like Jupiter. And if you remember, Jupiter is the Roman version of Zeus. Okay, and so you can see from that video that the Roman citizens are firmly on Caesar's side, and he is the sole leader with lots of support. Now we know that Caesar meets a messy end, but let's think about some of the things he did that maybe weren't so bad, and this will help us to understand why Romans loved him so much. So first, farmers were very, very highly taxed. Well, Caesar canceled all of those taxes on the farmers. If you were a father with 3 or more children, to help support you, you were given public land on which to live. Remember the problem the veterans had after the Punic Wars, coming back and their farms were destroyed. Well, things continued to be difficult for these veterans after the Punic Wars, and so Caesar created and gave jobs for these veterans so that they could make a living. And for other people out of work, he created even more jobs. And so Caesar employed people who weren't able to make livings before him. Instead of raising taxes for the poor and giving tax breaks to the rich, Caesar lowered the taxes on the poor. He had extravagant public parties and made sure that when people left, they were given free bread, oil for their lamps, and money. Also, he allowed people of the provinces to join the Senate. If you remember, you had to be a Roman citizen to be a member of the Senate. If you were in parts of the empire that Rome conquered, so maybe Spain or Gaul or Greece, you were not able to vote or be a part of the Senate. Caesar changed this when he expanded the Senate, and now people from the provinces had a voice in government. Now, all of this is going to anger the Senate because the Senate is losing its power. It's being taxed more. And so the Senate is going to be pushed and pushed and pushed by Caesar. And this is going to make them very unhappy. The Senate was also afraid that Caesar was going to become king. Being dictator, it was bad enough, but they believed that Caesar wanted to be king and that that would destroy the republic that they loved. And so because of all this, some of the senators felt like they had no choice other than to fight back against Caesar. Now, Caesar had a very close confidant. This was Marcus Brutus. He thought of him as a son. Marcus Brutus was a member of the Senate, and he also fought on Pompey's side during the civil war with Caesar. But Caesar, being very magnanimous, forgave the people who fought with Pompey and welcomed them back to Rome. Marcus Brutus is one of those people. Caesar trusted Brutus completely. However, Brutus is one of the main players who begin a plot to assassinate Caesar. This plot is made up by a large group of senators who make a plan that they're going to get together and they're going to assassinate Caesar. One famous quote is that one of the senators, Cassius, who is a part of this plan, says, "I hate the tyranny of Caesar," whereas Marcus Brutus said, "I hate Caesar the tyrant." And we know about governments. We know that tyrants illegally seize power. So we can tell, or we can infer by these statements, that the Senate did not believe Caesar was a legal ruler. They believe he stole power. And so Brutus is a part of the plot that hatches to assassinate Caesar. And we have some main players in this plot. So first is Caesar. Caesar upset many because they believed that he destroyed or is in the process of destroying the republic and becoming dictator for life. Next, you might be familiar with this name from your Egypt unit in learning about Cleopatra last year. This is Mark Antony. Mark Antony is Caesar's right-hand man. Now, we think about Mark Antony, he's sort of like a hero of the day, where we sort of celebrate our athletes today. Mark Antony was celebrated as being a really, really great fighter. Caesar loved him. During this assassination, Mark Antony is not there because he's waylaid or tricked by the other senators, so he doesn't enter the Senate house where Caesar's assassinated, and so Mark Antony isn't there and survives this assassination. And then last we have Brutus. He's a Roman senator. He is very, very close with Caesar and believes that Caesar destroyed the republic. Shakespeare writes a really, really famous quote about Brutus that says, "Et tu, Brute," and that quote is supposedly Caesar's dying words, that as he dies, he's shocked that Brutus betrays him, and he just can't believe it. Now, Caesar's murdered on a day called the Ides of March, but he's warned over and over again that this is a really unlucky day for him and he should not leave the house. The first person who warns Caesar is Calpurnia, his wife. She begs him to stay home. She has horrible dreams on that night before that she sees his bloody body and tells him it's an unlucky day for him. He should stay home. A fortune teller warns Caesar that the oracles tell of blood on this day, the Ides of March, and that Caesar must be careful. Caesar brushes both Calpurnia and the fortune teller off. Third, Caesar is given an anonymous note. On his way to the Senate house, he slipped a note. It's in his hand when he dies, and it warns him that he is going to be stabbed by 23 senators if he enters the Senate house. But Caesar didn't listen. Instead, he enters the Senate house and is murdered. So as Caesar enters the Senate house, he's walking in with his bodyguard, Mark Antony. Two senators come to Antony and tell him they have important business they need to talk to him about, and they pull him aside. Antony leaves, and Caesar continues into the Senate house, where he is approached by a group of senators. And the senators pretend to want to talk to him until one senator draws a knife and stabs him. Caesar is stabbed repeatedly. He is stabbed 23 times. Now, in Shakespeare's version, the final person who stabs him is Marcus Brutus, this man that he was very, very close to. At that point, Caesar stops fighting. During his assassination, he is described as being like a bull. He refuses to fall. He fights and fights. However, when Brutus stabs him his final time, Caesar falls to the ground, pulls his robes up over his head, and lays and dies. The senators run out of the Senate house. They yell, "Death to all tyrants," which is the same thing historically that the murderer or assassin of Abraham Lincoln says after shooting him. They yell, "Death to all tyrants." They run through the streets yelling, "Caesar's dead." But this is a grave miscalculation for the senators who thought that Rome would rise up and thank them for saving the Republic. Instead, the Romans run in their house. They close the door. They don't want to hear that Caesar's dead, because if we remember, Roman citizens loved him. And so the senators now have made a large mistake. They're going to ultimately run from Rome in hiding because they know after Caesar's assassination that the people loved Caesar and that they were going to have to face consequences for his death, rather than what they expected was cheers in the street. They were now exiled from Rome. And so Caesar died. After break, we're going to pick up with what happens after Caesar's death, which is going to be more war, more fighting, and another Caesar in charge. But the Ides of March is a very unlucky day. There's lots of information about other unlucky things that happen on the Ides of March, the same day that Caesar was killed, and it would be interesting for you to look that up. Now, for the rest of class, you're going to be doing a project that I will make a second video to describe for you. Thanks, guys.